Okay, this is Kalyna Somchynsky with Chrystia Chomiak, and this is for the URDC project Local Narratives, the Lives, Legacies, and Locales of Edmonton's Ukrainian Canadian community. Today, we will be speaking about the activity of Ukrainian Canadians in the feminist movement. So to begin our interview today, which will focus on the activities of your sister, Halyna Freeland, I'd like you to introduce and describe Halyna in a few sentences.
Okay, Halyna was my older sister by a year and a half. She was born in 1946 in Germany after the war, and we came to Canada in 48, and she grew up in Edmonton, essentially in Edmonton. She went to university, got a Bachelor of Arts, got her law degree, and practiced law in Peace River and also in Edmonton. So that's kind of the parameters of her. We grew up in a household where there were a lot of strong ideas discussed between our parents, and our mother was a very strong figure in our family. And we always used to say that we grew up in a feminist household because of her example of life, right? My parents had a very strong marriage, but they were different. They had different views. My mother was a member of the Liberal Party. My father was a member of the Conservative Party. Right? They had different religions. My mother was Orthodox. My father was Ukrainian Catholic. Right? So the minor differences to the outside world, larger differences on the inside. As we were growing up, as we were teenagers, there were a lot of social movements, especially in the United States and also in Europe. But most influential for us were in the United States. And we were immediately attracted by them. And when Halyna went to university, she became extremely active within and organizing and active within feminist and progressive circles. At that time in Edmonton, what are feminist and progressive circles? Well, feminist by itself, women's groups that were forming very often at that time was more like conscious raising, and support groups within organizations or within milieus to support each other and to put for, and to fight for equality. Halyna also came with a very strong social conscience. We were an immigrant family, and a large immigrant family, 6 kids, 2 parents, a lot of people, 1 wage earner. So things were always very hard for us economically. So very rich intellectually and culturally, very poor economically. For instance, my parents never owned a car. So, so we relied on the goodwill of others, taxi cabs, and of course, the transportation system. The public transport was important to us, and that was our main transport. Okay, so to say that we were very, very aware, and we lived in an area that was poor. A poorer part of it. At that time, it wasn't part of Edmonton when we grew up. When I was 16, Edmonton absorbed the town that we lived in, which was right next door. We shared a street. It was called Jasper Place. Anyhow, we were very aware of the social inequities and also the advantages that we had as a family that was educated. And so for us, confronting we lived in a place where we had to confront the social inequities in the society. And so that was a combination of a strong household, strong feminist, I would say a very strong female example in our household, and also having a very strong social conscience. I have to say that my parents were very much part of that, sharing that understanding. So that was the kind of household we grew up in, and that really shaped Halyna's and mine, but Halyna's point of view. So I hope does that answer the question?
Of course, yes.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could describe how both you and your sister Halyna experienced growing up in the Ukrainian Canadian community in particular. So for example, did you attend church, ходити на школа, participate in any choirs, or anything of that nature?
So yes, so my father was a real activist in the community, and an example for us of what to do. Not only an activist, but a supporter. So even though we didn't have a lot of money, he gave 10% of his salary to the community. That was just, a standard, that he expected us to carry on, that he did, and that didn't carry on. So what did we do? My father was a founder of the Курси Українознавства in Edmonton. So of course we went to Ukrainian school, and we went to Курси Українознавства. That was to be expected. We attended churches. Initially, our family was part of St. Joseph's church, and then when there was a split between Old Calendar and Gregorian and Julian calendar people, we moved with the Julian calendar people to St. George's. My mother had a lot of problems with that community, and she felt that they were very narrow, and so she had wanted one church for the family, but that experiment finished, and she became a member of St. John's Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral. And so we would go to two churches back and forth. Now, Halyna was always a very observant and critical thinker from a very young age. So she's the one that figured out that there was no Svetý Mikuláš, for instance, and told me at an early age, there is no Svetý Mikuláš, it is so-and-so. Because we would go to a community gatherings, concerts, and very often we participated, acted in those concerts in different ways. And she's the one that pointed it out. She also, at an early age, decided that she did not believe that this was going to save anybody. So for her going to church, she did it because that was expected, and also because because it was really part of our culture, right? My parents were very observant. We all fasted, we observed both the fast before Christmas and the fast before Easter in a serious way. My father was a cantor. My mother sang. My mother taught Ukrainian school at different churches at different times, at kindergarten as well. And so so church life was part of our upbringing. But for her, the belief in the church, and when she was, I don't think even a teenager, she already said, "Okay, this is it. This this doesn't work for me." And we were a team, and so so that we would have these discussions. Is it real or not? Is it correct or not? So, so we were very, so the church was very much part of our life, but in a cultural way. My father also was one of the people that founded Plast in Edmonton, and we attended Plast. And because we were fairly close in age, I was put, and because Halyna and I were very close, we were put into the same group. Normally you have, every age group, like every year you have a different one, different group of cohorts. But with this, they put us together because for whatever reasons, I can't remember. It doesn't matter. Anyhow, so that's another organization that Halyna belonged to, that we all as a family belong to, and played a significant role in our upbringing. So the Ukrainian community, so those are kind of the institutions, but the Ukrainian post-World War II community was really, really interesting. It was extremely vibrant. There would be very often Sunday afternoons, you'd go to a hall and there would be presentations, discussions, primarily political, but also historical, that were very interesting, not dry. And there was a lot of debate. So you had different ideological positions, but there was open debate. The other thing about those discussions that I remember is that when people really disagreed with somebody, there'd be a lot of booing. So you'd have a large community, different points of view, and somebody would be speaking, and then you'd have, a whole chorus of people going, just denouncing the person, denouncing the point of view. So it was very dynamic, and that kind of discussion in our house, often people would come over, and there would be those kind of discussions. Sometimes literary, sometimes political, often historical, often about Ukraine. So that was the kind of life that we grew up in. So we grew up with the life of an idea that, discussion, debate, writing, producing, cultural things were of import, and that's how you should do it. There was also of interest a visual arts community. There were a number of painters that had immigrated after the Second World War. Now there are a number of people here that were painters that somehow that connection didn't take place, or maybe it did, but I didn't see it. From my point of view, I didn't see it. But Butzmanuk, who painted St. Joseph's Cathedral, he was an active member in the community. He had an art school. Paraskevia Ivanets as well, a very interesting artist, a painter. She studied at Banff. She studied with Butzmanuk, and she completed St. Joseph's when he died. There were some areas that had not been completed, and so she completed those. But she would go every summer to summer school at Banff Center, and some of her teachers were from the group of 7. So she had that particular influence as well. Anyhow, so it was, and there were others. I'm just, those. So it was a very vibrant community that we grew up in, and that we felt very much at home in. But we also felt that we didn't feel that we were mainstream. We also always felt that we were somehow. We weren't part of the mainstream. That's for sure. We always felt that we were like somehow at the margins of that community, even though we were very, very much part of it.
So how did this dynamic of the Ukrainian community and your experiences both at home and within the Ukrainian community shape Halyna's interests and ambitions as they would develop kind of through her teenage years and into her student and early adult life?
So community and family, right? Okay, so firstly, family. My father was a lawyer in Ukraine. He was a journalist. He became a journalist, but he started off as a lawyer. And my sister decided that she would be a lawyer, that this would be, but she also was a journalist. So at university, she was on the editorial board of the Gateway, duplicating what my father in reverse order, right? But law was something of not only of interest, but of discussion. Apart, even though my father was not a practicing lawyer, some of his friends were. And so, but it isn't so much the occupation, but the analysis and the discussion, right, of law and its place, right? So that definitely shaped her. The love of Ukrainian life, the experience of it being a vibrant and life for Halyna and for me was she wanted very much. She was, it gave her a lot of nourishment. So that, she was always very, very. Because it was so meaningful and so positive, such a positive experience. What she would do, and later on, is when, for instance, when she moved to Peace River, she became very active in the Ukrainian community there. She taught Ukrainian school. She organized events. So she was very active within that community because for her that experience was very positive. So that's in broad terms, it was very positive, and it continued throughout her life. So one of the things, teenage girls, we would at night, one of the things that we talked about is, what are we going to do if we marry a non-Ukrainian, right? And we made a pact. Okay, so should we marry a non-Ukrainian? Because we weren't that enthralled with the young, with the men, the boys that we knew. So we said, and I think we're going to have to go outside this particular circle. This may not work for us. So we made a pact that we would, that our children would know Ukrainian, and that they would be part of the community. So this was the pact that we made. So, okay, we can marry a non-Ukrainian, but we will definitely ensure that the next generation will be Ukrainian. So that's a pact that she was very clear, she was very focused, and it's something that she ensured would happen. Mm-hmm.
Now, turning to Halya's really strong involvement within the fight for women's rights and the feminist movement, how did she become involved in this community? And this could be both in relation to reflections on the Ukrainian Canadian community and outside the Ukrainian Canadian community, because of course, I understand that the women's rights movement, as you would have been exposed to it, might not have come through the Ukrainian Canadian community, but through a wider societal movement.
In fact, yes. So not only did it come through the Ukrainian community, but it was separate, right? They were completely separate. It was only later on that she combined the two. So one is the Ukrainian community involvement, and the other is the feminist and in the women's movement. So Halyna was a leader in the feminist movement in Edmonton. So Edmonton and Peace River. So she moved to Peace River right after law school. She got married very early. Again, at the beginning, it was conscious raising groups and pushing for support of women in roles. She formed along with her friend Jean McBean, who is unfortunately she passed away from cancer. She formed a women's group within the Law Society, and they lobbied for, I mean, all kinds of things. But she at that time had one child, and she lobbied for the right to bring her child to class, for instance, when Chrystia was very small, right? So there was a lobbying effort for that. There was a lobbying. So they formed a group with the other women there to support one another. They lobbied for a more enrollment of women in law school. They challenged the status quo on many levels. So that's one of the things in the early years that she did in Edmonton. When she moved to Peace River, one of the things that she did is that she worked representing lesbian couples who didn't have any standing, right? No rights. So she was very active in defending lesbian couples, and is in fact through her work that she met two women, Margaret Smith and Julianne LeGras, and together they formed Common Women Books. So when Halyna moved to Edmonton, right, they all put in, whatever amount of money, and they all formed the collective. That was a gang of three at first. Anyhow, but her most important, so she represented also women in divorce cases very often. And one of the things that she saw is that women, especially farm women, had no rights to property. And so she got a group of female lawyers together, and they lobbied for the what is called Matrimonial Properties Act. And she was one of the key leaders there, again, with others. You're never a one-man band. And they were successful in bringing in the matrimonial property law that recognized the contribution that women made in a farm, even if it was not working in the fields, and that the property was to be shared equally after in a divorce, in a divorce case. So that was a huge achievement, because at that time, women on the farm had no rights, right? They got divorced. Well, goodbye. You leave with nothing, right? So this was a huge development. So that's so Halyna's work in the feminist movement and for fighting for women's rights was separate completely from the Ukrainian community.
Now, before I ask about some concrete examples of some organizations that Halyna worked in, could you discuss how, how she came to the idea to combine her work in feminism and women's rights and the amazing work she did through law with the Ukrainian Canadian community?
One of the I would say that I had an influence on that. So in Toronto, I was part of a very progressive group of people who did a lot of different things. And we were able to be both Ukrainian, to be progressive on Ukrainian issues. In Edmonton, there was not that group. So you need a community of people. Again, you're not a one-man band. I mean, for Halyna, these two are passions. It's her, driving what drove her, right? And we, one of the things that about our second wave feminism is that feminists weren't supposed to be divided. Like, you weren't supposed to be this over here and this over here, right? The personal is political, right? So Halyna was always a very strong Ukrainian and a very strong feminist and very strong progressive. Right? So all those three things were together, right? They're always together. So when the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was formed, a number of people moved to Edmonton who were from that progressive Ukrainian milieu. And and because of that, there was a group that was started. It was called Hromada Cultural Society, and Halyna was part of that. So combining Ukrainian progressive feminine became a possibility, right? Then you didn't have to have it, then it wasn't separate, right? You could be who you were, right? So you require a group of people, right, to do things, right? And so then she was able to organize other initiatives, because there was a group of people who were also who would be potentially or were interested in that sort of thing. Yeah, so that's how it happened. But before, it wasn't. And why I say is that I introduced her to many of these people. Now, I mean, she would have found her way if I wasn't, but she had met them in other, when she came to visit, for instance, into her. So there was already there was a connection. And of course, we talked about these things all the time, right? I mean, so we would, I hated talking on the phone, but she would talk to me sometimes on the phone for a longer period of time. She was never a phone person. Anyhow, it's just for, what are the facts, ma'am? And then go on. But we would talk about it, and I always came back at Christmas time. Sometimes I was here for the summer holidays. But even I'd come back in the summer, and I, when she lived in Peace River, I would visit her there and help her out there, because she had 2 kids and a career and everything else, right? So she was extremely active there. Anyhow, so of course we discussed these things, right? So and she wanted that to be able to do things that, to combine, if you like, but for it to be not separate.
So could you tell me a little bit more about this Hromada cultural group and how it also gave lead to the Hromada women's group and later the Hromada Housing Co-op?
Yeah, so in the late 70s, it was, so you had a number of people who came either back to Edmonton or came to Edmonton that were part of that progressive Ukrainian milieu from Toronto. As well, you had, SUSC used to be very active in Toronto. And then there was a group of people here at the University of Alberta who were also very progressive, right? These were primarily men in the SUSC movement. There are some women, very few, very few women, primarily men. Anyhow, so this milieu, it's first centered around a number of the people within, at that time, SUSC had a house together. It was called the Koskovich House, I believe. Anyhow, so it became a center, a physical place where people could drop in and do things, right? And so, and Halyna became part of that milieu. She was, of course, older, as were some, there's that younger group, older group. I mean, at this point, it doesn't make any difference. There's a little bit of an age difference. So when the organization, and at one point, people realized that it would be so much better to form an actual organization. And it was called the Hromada Cultural Society. And the reason for that was it was an acknowledgement. When Drahomanov, one of the things that he wrote, one of the things that he was involved in and that he started was a journal. It was called Hromada. And it was a progressive journal, right? So our historian, John Paul Hemka, said, why don't we call it Hromada after this? And we said, oh, that's a great history. This works for us, right? So that's how the name was started. But it was those people that came to work at the Institute and this the Susk people, and then some community people like my sister Halyna, Myrna Kostash as well. Anyhow, so they formed the group. I came in 79, I became part. So it was a cultural society. And what the cultural society did is that we made connections with other immigrant groups and supported them. So for instance, at that time there was a new Chilean community. So we reached out to them, and our outreach would be that we would have potluck suppers at community halls, and we would then have a discussion. They would talk about their situation, right? What's going on in Chile, and we would talk about what's going on both in Canada and in Ukraine, right? And making those kind of connections with the Eritreans as another community that we reach out. We reach out to different ones. We also supported labor actions that were happening in Edmonton. So we supported the Gainer strike, which at that time in the late 70s, early 80s, was it went on for years, and we would picket with them and supported them. So that, and then our goal was to have progressive Ukrainian events. And also just to have Ukrainian events together, right? So we did a number of things like Ivana Kupala. We would celebrate together. We'd go someplace and build fires and have do different things there. And then we also celebrated Malanka together. So we started celebrating Malanka, and we would do all the cooking ourselves, and then invite family and friends and celebrate together. And and we'd put on a play. Very often at the beginning, we had writers and write a play, and then we would put it on, and it was great. It was very good. How the Hromada Women's Group started is that we would, I don't remember how often we would meet. Let's say we had monthly meetings, as needed, but monthly meetings. We had a very loose structure, but I think that we elected, some kind of an executive. I think we did that. I can't really remember whether we did that or not. I have all the archives of the Hromada Cultural Society if you're interested. Anyhow, so I'm going to be sending them to Winnipeg, but you could take a look at them if you're interested before I send them to the archives in Winnipeg, because that's where we've decided us as a group, as a larger group, where we're going to be sending our archives, our progressive Ukrainian archives will be going there. So that should be part of that collection. Okay, that's aside. How the Hromada women's group started is that I and a few others saw that we would have meetings, and while, quote, the men all said, they were feminist and supported feminism and blah, 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 and women's rights, etc. What would happen at the meeting is that we'd be sitting around talking about an issue, and a guy would say, introduce that, or we'd have a discussion, and one of the women would say something. The other guy would be like, ignore what she said and talk, and then the third guy would repeat what the woman said as if it was his ideas, and then the men would kind of decided that this was, a great idea, right? And so the women, while central, were also marginalized. And I saw that this, that this was happening. Firstly, you're a little confused the first time it happened, second time, and go, okay, so this is what's happening, is that we're being ignored. So one of the things that, one of the ways that you counteract that is that the women have to form a group. And so we formed a group, and they said, okay, well, how we're going to deal with this at meetings is that when, if you don't agree with somebody, that's fine, but acknowledge what the other woman said, and then speak to that, right? Acknowledge what the other person said. And so as a team, right, as a group, all the women, I think Olenka, if I remember, Olenka and I met and said, I said, I think, of course, I would have first talked with Halyna because we were very close, and blah 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 going on, and understanding it can't be the two of us, right? So Olenka, Melnik and I met, and Olenka said, yes, correct, yes, that's what's happening. And I said, would you be interested in forming a group? And she said, yes, let's do that. And of course, Myrna, right? And then we formed the group, and then we announced at the meeting that we now have a Hromada women's group. And the men were not amused. They go, well, why? We're all equal. We're all, participating. And we said, no, we're not all equal. You are ignoring us. You disregard our views, or you take them on as yours and don't give credit, don't acknowledge where it came from. So we will, we don't like that. We don't like that. It's not working for us. So that's how the Hromada Women's Group started.
And how did the Hromada Women's Group give rise to the Hromada Co-op?
So it's a couple of different things. So one of the things is that at that time, there was a change of relationships. John Paul and I got together, and Halyna had a house, and we lost our apartments because other people that we were with had those apartments, took those dwellings. And so we asked, whether we could stay with Halyna, and she said, sure, right? So we moved in with Halyna, and it was great. It was wonderful, but it was tight. And then so it was tight. And so in Edmonton, there were a couple of co-ops that had been built, and Halyna, through Common Woman Books, knew a number of the women in Sundance Co-op, which is the largest co-op. I think it's still the largest co-op in Edmonton. So and occasionally there would be gatherings, in the 70s and 80s, we would gather at homes, right? Potlucks were very common, and then you'd have a discussion. Maybe you invited somebody to talk, maybe you just talked together, right? So having both social events that were political, and then before and after actions, or sometimes to develop actions, right? So this was common, and so we would meet in Sundance and at the co-op. So there was some really nice feminists who lived there, and we would gather there. So we knew about co-ops from the milieu at large, I was thinking of joining a co-op, that this would be a place for, and anyhow, so Halyna and I discussed this, and she said, okay, let's form a co-op. And I said, our own co-op? She said, yes, let's form a Ukrainian feminist socialist co-op. I said, sounds great to me. The first person we went to was the Roman patrician. And the reason we went to Roman patrician is because at Hromada Cultural Society meetings, he would often say, what we need to do is we have to form a co-op. And we'd all, shake our heads, yes, we have to form a co-op, and then nothing, unless somebody grabs it by the horns and makes it their thing, nothing. So we went to Roman and said, we want to form a co-op, and a housing cooperative. And he said, oh, I didn't mean a housing cooperative. He was thinking of a different type of a co-op, right? But he's the one that would say, let's form a co-op. We translated it into whatever we thought, a co-op was, right? So, so then we talked to other, I think on the radio, we talked to her, maybe even that first, there was a Saturday afternoon, it was beautiful and sunny, and we went to Communitas, which was an organization that helps the development. And we had just gone there, and we gotten information, and I think we met Anna on the street, and we said, Anna, we're gonna be doing this. And she goes, oh, that sounds great, count me in. Anyhow, went to the women's group. And the women's group, a lot of the people were really interested in it. Went to Hromada Cultural Society, and fewer were interested, but some were interested in it. And so we were able to have that base of people that wanted it, right? So that's how the co-op developed from the Cultural Society, from the women's group, from need. So in the early 80s, just let me tell you that interest rates for mortgages were in the high teens, like 18% mortgage, yes. So getting into the housing market, I mean, it's really hard now. But getting a mortgage, we could have done, but the interest rate was so high that it was just crazy. We thought it was just crazy, right? So you take so having a cooperative, a housing cooperative seemed the way to go. And it also because within our community, there are people of means and people who didn't have means. And in a co-op, that's what you can do, is that you can combine, so you can have a community of people so if you're low income or if you're high income, you can all live together and help each other, right? And so that was also very appealing to our, progressive views. Yeah, so that's how they were formed. 1, 2, 3.
And could you just talk a little bit more about life in the co-op? Like, how did you get everything together? How did you choose a neighborhood? Did you work with an architect? Were the buildings already standing?
Yeah. So okay. So firstly, how we formed it. So we outlined. We would meet at Halyna's house because she had a house. And so with a large table, and we'd sit around her table and discuss this and say, okay, these are our principles, and then go, so these are our principles. What does that mean to our governance? How do we do it? So we agreed that what we would be trying to do is that we would work for consensus, that we would not have a hierarchy, that everybody that was a member would be a member of the board, because there are regulations. You can't just willy-nilly decide. There are regulations that there are co-op bylaws that you have to fall under. So within that, how you can define yourself, right? So what we said, okay, yes, we have to have a board of directors, then everybody will be on the board of directors, so that it's direct democracy, not representational democracy. So that was a discussion. How do you incorporate feminism? Well, consensus is very important. Everybody being heard. So one of the things that we instituted is that, and it's in our bylaws. No, it's in our bylaws, is that when we have a discussion, we can ask for a round table so that everybody can speak on the question, right? So that it's not, two strong people with strong points of view discussing back and forth, right? No. And especially when you see that happening, then what you want is you want to have the round circle so that everybody can participate. So that was another principle. And then it's cooperative. You have to work together, right? That's the name of the game. And then in terms of, so that's how our principles translated into our functioning. Okay, what was it? So that was, you asked
principles, and then like the physical location of the co-op. So
physical location. So Halyna's law office was on just off of White and 104th. And she, which is very close to here. And we were looking for places. And the first place we looked was in Northeast Edmonton, where the Ukrainians are. We thought that would be a wise thing. So we were looking, okay, once we formed and were incorporated and became a society and were incorporated, had reached certain agreements with both CMHC and with that we were going forward, we had to find property. So we were looking for property, go different places and go, like, of course, we wouldn't be the whole gang, but we had always a subcommittee, right, that would go and take a look. And also individuals, right? We were out there looking. And Halyna came to a meeting and she says, I've got the perfect place. She would go for walks. And she saw that this place, that in this area, that I don't think that they had any signs yet, but she had heard, anyhow, through that City Hall was going to be selling this property. What they had done previously is that the city had come in and purchased a number of, almost all the properties. There was a few holdouts, one or two still holdouts that didn't sell to the city. In these, on 86th and 87th Avenue. Why? Because the LRT was going to go on the tracks behind us. Then they changed their minds and the LRT was not going to go there. So they had this property and we found out that they had this property. So we made we went to the city and we said, okay, we would like to buy all this property that you have. And of course, for the city, they go, oh yes, okay, I'm extremely interested, because then they don't have to sell it, parcel by parcel. And they can get it off their books. And so Halyna arranged a great contract with the city that we would we would pay a not-for-profit cost, and it would be eliminated after 25 years or whatever. Yeah, it was great. It was a wonderful. So, I mean, the most anyhow. So anyhow, that's how it happened, right? Is that the first two people, Hala had the office, and then Anna Radio had Zoriana, and Hala found out about it, and the two of them came, walked around the neighborhood, and both of them said, yes, okay, this is where this is what we, and of course our discussion is, should we be here, great location, or should we be in Northeast Edmonton, right? So that's how that's been, and of course, this one out. So that's that's the location. And the third part of that question was,
just describe in a couple sentences what life was and is still like in the Hromada. Like, how would you describe?
Okay, so life at first was, we were all learning to live together. Right, not that we all live together in the same place, but learning how it is that you can actually live together cooperatively and make decisions that are good decisions for everyone. There were things that so it was a very dynamic, lots of different points of view, but very cohesive. I would say, not entirely, sometimes people would get upset, because their point of view didn't gain the support. So there was some of that, but I would say that was more minor at the beginning, and it was, it was the honeymoon period. And one of the things that started happening, a number of us said, what we want to do is to have children in the co-op. What we want to be able to raise our children together in a Ukrainian environment without having to drive them on Saturday to a Ukrainian function, and therefore you're Ukrainian on Saturday, from 9 to 12 or whatever, right? That we wanted to have that within the whole community, right? And that's what happened. People started having children, or people came with little children, right? And so you had, for the children especially, they're still very close friends. They're like brothers and sisters, right? There's a bond there that we were very successful in they're the, in raising, and there's a very strong identity. I would, it varies, but for them, being Ukrainian is a very positive thing, right? Now, what does that mean? Everybody interprets it differently, and it has a different, right? So life was it was great, our kids would go from house to house, they kind of grew up they grew up in the bubble that we created, and they thought the whole world was like that. Not really. So those were very exciting. You did ask, how was the architect chosen? We had a committee. We, decided what we were looking for. We sent out requests, or we asked different architects to send us proposals. We narrowed it down, we interviewed them all, and we took Jean Dube to be our architect. But one of the people that said they were going to be interested was Cardinal. We approached Cardinal, and he thought it was a really interesting project. Anyhow, so he came up with a design too, right? So there were different, people that we looked around. Who are the architects? He said, "Would you be interested in this housing project?" Right? This is who we are, and they'd say, "Oh yeah, this sounds really," and of the ones that said they were interested, then we would check them out, and took the proposals, of course, to the body, and that's how that happened, right? Okay, so that was the way life was, and then and then we went through periods. So at first we had a lot of Ukrainians, so about 60%, I'd say, Ukrainian. we always said we weren't going to be exclusively, like you didn't have to show your Ukrainian lineage, right? But that you understood this was a community that wanted to develop Ukrainian language and culture. And if you wanted to be part of that community, come on in, right? We didn't ever want to be exclusive, but we wanted to ensure that we would be able to, that we could develop language and culture. And then, you know, people's lives changed. And then for some people living cooperatively, just, you know, the experiment had a life, a beginning and end. And that's fine. And they moved on to buy their own properties, and or they moved out of the city. But more often, you know, they moved on to have their own properties. And again, that was fine. But there was an exodus of people. And then, but we always had we would always get new people. So the feeders. So the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, people would come to the institute and they go, okay, where can I find housing? Oh, this looks like a great place. Could we get in here? Now, sometimes we were able to accept, you know, sometimes there would be a short waiting list, and sometimes, sorry, this won't happen. So that was one of the feeders. The other is just people within the community would hear about us, and, you know, through the co-op movement, or just generally, you know, and apply. So when kind of after that first initial group, when a number of people moved out, we had a more transient, I'd say, membership. People would come, live here for, you know, 3-4 years, and then move on, right? So there was a more transient, and it became less Ukrainian. And then with independence, people started coming from Ukraine, and it wasn't immediately, of course, independence. I would say in the 2000s, what happened is that people who grew up in an independent Ukraine, and who had made choices. Either they were progressive, or they were a number of gay and lesbian couples. When they found out about us, that, oh, this looks interesting, and we said, oh yes, well, we're also interested. So both bring in new Ukrainians whose culture is, of course, completely different than ours, and who bring a Ukrainianism that is very interesting, yes, for us, right? And so so we were, you know, so it was a time where we were able to, when people were moving out, they moved in. And so the life of the community now has become, we have a significant group that are from Ukraine, who are progressive in the broad sense, right? That have, quote, alternative. I mean, are you alternative if you're gay and lesbian? I don't know. That used to be what we said. It's no longer, it's mainstream, right? But within the Ukrainian community, it probably is still alternative, because the community has become more and more conservative over the years, right? So people find it comfortable, a supportive place, and how has it changed? We still celebrate Malanka, but we also celebrate Gay Pride Day, and we used to, before COVID, when there was a parade, you know, we took part in the parade, right? And we have a rainbow pierogi because we have some people, rainbow vareniki meal during the afternoon, which is great. So how it's changed is that I would say the new Ukrainians, I mean, have made a really important addition, and they've revived the co-op in a way that is different. Now, so now I'm, so of course, the post-World War II immigration is now the old Ukrainians. So, the celebration of Malanka still happen. It's in those old ways, quote. But the Rainbow Varenik, event is the new ways, right?
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing about the whole history of the Hromada, which is really interesting. I would like to turn our attention now to a project that Halyna helped initiate and was really involved in, and that's Common Woman Books. So I was wondering if you could discuss how she became involved in this, in starting this bookstore with 2 other individuals, and describe what kind of books they carried and what it was like when you entered the shop, what kind of events they would put on, and any memories you have of Common Woman Books yourself.
Okay, so Common Woman Books, Halyna was, she read all the time. Like, she would sit down, like she devoured books, all kinds of books. I had a couple of I have another sister who did the same thing. Like, they would sit down, they'd come over, and then they'd be sitting and reading, right? Like, she was just, she loved books. When she lived in Peace River, she'd come to Edmonton, and one of the things was always to go to a bookstore, I'd grab a whole pile of books, take them back. And, books were really, really, that's how information, that's how ideas were spread. And that's it. So Common Woman Books. So in Peace River, she met Margaret Smith, who she defended. And I believe that Margaret won. Not always. It didn't always happen. So it didn't always happen. Okay. Anyhow, so they saw that they were kindred spirits, and they talked about forming a bookstore together, right? Starting a bookstore. Halyna's relationship fell apart. She moved to Edmonton. Margaret had either just previously, whatever, Margaret was in Edmonton as well. And in the mid-70s, they formed Common Woman Books. And they invited Julianne Legras. So I'm not exactly sure how Julianne Legras, but she was, there was the 3 of them. So they formed the bookstore together. And at first it was in Halyna's basement. In other words, that's where they would order. They formed a society, of course, or a company, and they started importing books. And how they would sell them is they would go to events. So there were many feminist events throughout Edmonton at that time. So it was, a large and different progressive ones, and they'd set up a table and they would sell. That's how you bought progressive books at that time. You'd have a book table, and it wasn't. Anyhow, it was of import. You would sometimes go to events just to get your books, right? Where you could get ideas. So they would set up tables and sell books, and then they started inviting authors. So my memory is, coming back at Christmas time and Halyna and staying with Halyna, and she would have, Common Woman Books would have on a Sunday, it would be a potluck. Of course, you have to have food. And then you gather around in the living room, it was wall-to-wall people, everybody sitting on the floor and having a speaker, somebody, a book, or sometimes a movie, you know, somebody who's just, talking about it, discussion, book sale, always. You could buy books. Anyhow, it became too much for Halyna's house to contain. And they bought a house not far away. Halyna lived in Norwood at that time. And not far away, they bought a house. Margaret lived on the second floor, and Common Woman Books was on the first floor. So that was where they went. And then the readings continued. The outreach was always there. And around Common Woman Books, a number of they were able to form a collective of people, right? So it's not these three. These three are the ones that they put in the beginning. They initiated it. They put in the money, blah blah, and then there was a collective that formed around it. And the collective would run the bookstore, right, at different times. You signed up. You worked. For that particular day, or for however it was, right? But you always, so it was staffed and going to book sales, to events, and setting up a book table. And then they outgrew that store, that house, because it was still a house. And Halyna was she had her law office on 104th Street, and just off of White. And the downstairs was being rented, and so Halyna was able to get that place. And the bookstore moved in there. They redid it, and that the bookstore ran through there. And then later on, they moved right beside Garneau Theatre. There is, now there are different restaurants, but there was an area there that was for rent, and Common Woman Books moved in there. How was it? Well, it was always so exciting to go in there. It was just also very nice. Some people just went there for comfort, right? I worked at Common Woman Books for a couple of years. So, so first it was like as any kind of those kind of public places, people that are in transition, in quest, in struggle, that they'll gravitate there. So some of the people were there, but for others, it was a great gathering place. So, of course, feminist literature goes without saying. There was a Ukrainian section. Goes without saying. English, of course, everything is English language, right? In this bookstore, there were on critical theory, political theory, history, and then there was a large literature section focusing on women authors, but not exclusive, And then the other sections included, like astrology and, the gems or whatever, that kind of thing. Witchcraft, smaller, right? But it was there. That was all part of that. And then there were also, so besides that, and then there was bling. So there'd be t-shirts. One of my favorites was, "If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution." Rosa Luxemburg saying it was Halyna's favorite. She had that. She wore that a lot. So different T-shirts, and then some merchandise, right? That was kind of in that, not kind of, but in that vein. That kind of merchandise was in there as well. So one of the ways that you got people into the store, besides going out, is that you'd have events in. And so we would have, the Common Woman Books had events. So when I worked at the bookstore, that was my primary role, though you never had just a single role. You sold books, you put them through the computer, all that stuff, that how you run the bookstore, but also organizing readings. And so we would try and do at least one reading a month. Sometimes we would do it more often. And then also partnering with different publishing houses. So we'd do readings with them. We did a couple of readings with Canadians do Ukrainian Studies at the books. Anyway, we would partner with different publishers. for readings, and advertise their authors. So that's what it was like. It was very active. Now, as time went on, bookstores stopped being as important. That was one of the things. But more important is that the collective was getting tired. People are getting older and weren't able to put in the time. And so more and more the staff ran the bookstore. It's also always a tension as well when you have staff and you have a collective, right? Working that out, how that worked, is always a challenge, right? So at the end, Margaret and Julianne LeGras had withdrawn from the bookstore, and of the original members, it was Halyna from the beginning to the end that had the bookstore. It was sad, but it was time, because it didn't have if the collective was reborn, right, with new people that were active, it would have continued. Yeah.
And now, could you tell me about one other major initiative that Halyna was part of, and that was the Second Wreath Society and the Second Wreath Conference that took place in Edmonton in 1985?
Right. So, the Second Wreath Society, Halyna started taking courses at the University of Alberta in Ukrainian language and literature, and so she read about the Second Wreath, the first. It wasn't, what was it called? Oi, Boże. Perszy Winok. Okay, Perszy Winok. So she read about it and she goes, oh, it's going to be 100 years since those first suffragettes organized this fantastic conference gathering. It's so she said, let's commemorate this. Let's form a society, and let's let us organize something. Let's organize a conference. Let's have, so of course she went to the Hromada Women's Group. I think that we were all in favor. She talked to other people, and we formed an organization, and we started planning. Now, and then we worked. Now so we decided on a conference, but before the conference, Halyna wanted to. She organized a banquet with others to honor women that had made a real contribution in Edmonton, Ukrainian women who made it. And so that took place first, and then the conference. Now, and on the conference, so what we did, we had concurrent sessions, because there were so many topics to talk about that we couldn't have it all in one. We invited all the traditional Ukrainian women's organizations. We invited Feminist organization, Status of Women Action Committee to it. So it was a very broad range that we invited. We had a lot of support, and we had a lot of questions that were raised about us, and a lot of misconceptions about how who we were. But when the conference took place, we did have representatives from Ukrainian women's organizations from Toronto. I believe New York, but I'm not 100% sure but I'm quite sure that they were there as well, and who were very interested, who saw us no longer as enemies, but not necessarily saw us as part of, not like them, but similar, right? Different, but part of the group. And so that was all very good. The other thing is that we were able to have, it also went not just, the post-World War II Ukrainian women's organization, but the ones that had been there earlier. And that was very important for us as well. Very important. So Savella Statistician spoke at the conference, and that was really, really good. It was a little, so it was a great event. I would say the challenge that we had is, while we were able to bring so many different people together, to unite them, like we didn't have, when we set it up and we achieved our goal, was to have a lot of discussion, bring people together. We didn't plan on how is it that we're going to go to the next step, right? But is there going to be like some resolutions? Are we going to elect a body to move forward with this? So that going forward afterwards, we hadn't discussed it, and it wasn't part of it. And so I would say that was the problem with it, is that it remained with us. And so while you had this great gathering afterwards, we didn't use that great gathering to move forward. We didn't pull in others, and so that was the challenge. And I think that's why we achieved our goal, but weren't able to take advantage of what we had done. Right. So but it was great. It was great. It was great to be able, generational, different perspectives, but to have that, and to be as the prime organizers, to have it from a very clear feminist perspective, right? Because the Ukrainian women's organizations weren't feminist. They had a lot of strong women, active, not feminists. So I think people then change their mind. One of the things is that one of the women, she was from Toronto, from Soyuz Ukrainian, thought that we were extremely radical socialists, and she had heard about the co-op. Co-op already existed then, and she wanted, she asked me, okay, I want to see this, and I took her, and she says, well, these are townhouses, duplexes. I said, yes, and he goes, well, I thought you guys all lived together. They expected the great commune, right? and it wasn't a commune. But so that was the Second Wreath Society, and it had a big influence in Edmonton, among women. It may, the ones that had been active before, but also that you can, that not only that you can be active, but that we have a very strong history and presence today. So that was very good. That was very good, and that the goals were achieved.
I know before I asked this question, there was something you wanted to add, and I want to make sure you have the opportunity to say that before it slips your brain.
Okay, so I also wanted to add that another thing that Halyna formed was, it only lived for a couple of years, was the Alberta Women's magazine. Now, we have a number of magazines out now that are called women's magazines that are primarily sell products to quote women. Right? But this was not. This was an actual magazine that discussed women's issues, right? And so She was the publisher. She financed it. And there was an editor that was hired, and there was an editorial board. And I wasn't involved in that, but it was very important. You know, it was a great place to publish articles. And it wasn't financially feasible. So after a couple of years, Haga closed it down. Yeah. So, but it was very important.
So I was wondering how you and Halyna celebrated International Women's Day, or March 8th.
So International Women's Day, before it was absorbed by government and others, recognized, how we would do it is that, of course, there would be a committee of different, organizations and individuals, and we would always have a demonstration at first. So we would demonstrate. We'd walk through, I don't know, maybe we'd go to City Hall, maybe we'd go to the legislature. We would have some destination that we would walk with, and with our placards. People had different issues: equal work for equal pay for equal work, daycare, abortion rights. So different issues, right? That were that were addressed, but there was always a demonstration, and it could be fairly militant. It could be sometimes fairly small, but there would always be a demonstration. Now, March 8th in Edmonton is not always warm, right? So we would always be cold. I remember that we would make sure that we would march through. We would make our presence known. We would sing songs. There was a lot of singing. So there would be sheets, you'd hand out sheets, so we would, Bread and Roses, we would sing several times, but other songs that we would sing. And then there would be some place that we would gather sometimes, and different people would speak. We'd invite different speakers. And then we would go home. Sometimes there would be potlucks afterwards. Sometimes there would be a gathering at a community center or not, but one of the issues that we would also address is besides the international, so that was International Women's Day. So it was a militant operation, right? It was it was an awareness raising for us to raise awareness, but also an opportunity to talk about the issues that were important to us. And it could be sometimes fairly small. So, maybe 100 people. Sometimes it was much larger, right? But it could be fairly small. And then you felt, kind of the smallness of of your presence and of your politics, of what you're trying to do, right? So, but different before that, you'd always make up a placard, right? What's my issue, right? And you'd come to the place with your placard and your warm hats and everything else, right? Because you'd be walking through the snow, and so that's how we would celebrate, is that we would demonstrate and sing songs and talk about our issues. So that's how we did it. There was another demonstration that we would always have as well, and that was Take Back the Night. So safety for women is a concern, a big concern, right? So we would have demonstrations, Take Back the Night. There were women that were being attacked and raped and killed, and so we would, why Take Back the Night? Because the talking heads would say, okay, women should not go outside. When it's dark, don't go outside. The answer is hide. So we would, so our thing is, no, we're going to take back the night. And so it'd be at night that we would have a demonstration through in an area where there would have been violence, right? So to take back that to be able to be safe. That now having a demonstration doesn't make it safe, but it does draw attention to the problem.
And there was another activity that I was wondering if you could speak about, and that was how you connected or collaborated with Ukrainian and Eastern European activists through any of these larger initiatives. So, for example, the Mamonova tour or actions in defense of Ukrainian political prisoners as well.
I'm not sure of the dates of that tour, but so at that time, it was in the 80s, of course, right? We supported Ukrainian women political prisoners and Soviet women so they may have been separate. We tried to put the two together and not to have it separate, right? So it would be Soviet women political prisoners. And of course, we were very interested. So when I say interested, what did we do? We read about it, right? We followed the literature. We wanted to know about women who were political prisoners, and also especially women who had some feminist leanings, or would say that they are that, right? So that would have been, and so that's why Mamonova was chosen. She was expelled, right? Or she left with her husband and child, right? So she left, and she called herself a feminist, right? So that was very interesting for us, and we wanted to make that connection. So we organized a tour. At that time, the progressive Ukrainian community across Canada had a lot of connection between each other. So it was possible to create a tour, to organize a tour, right? So that was how we were able to do that, right? So there was a strong group in Toronto, strong group in Edmonton, and then contacts in other places who were able to, and interest, right? Not just, not just the activists, but interest in a broader sense, so that you could have that. And of course, within the community here, there was a lot of, within the feminist women's organization, there's a lot of awareness about us and Ukrainian issues because of our activity, right? So why that? So the question that you asked, did we connect? Well, we connected as best we could. And then when a woman was released, we tried to have contact with her, right? So Raisa, I've talked about Raisa Moroz earlier. She's a very interesting woman. But there were a few others as well. And so we would try and have just let them know who we were, and to say that we supported them, and see how we could support them, so there was just a lot of interest in following how do women from the Soviet Union that are activists and have been imprisoned for their views, how can we, what are they saying? How can we support them? And just solidarity, just solidarity with them, right? And so that photo that you showed of the demonstration, that's what, we're carrying signs of different women, right? Political prisoners. Yeah.
And I imagine it was pretty challenging getting in touch in that time too, because you're dealing with women who are in the Soviet Union. So the lines of communication.
Yeah, you can only get in touch with them when they leave.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's because it's, very dangerous for them, for them to, of course, right? And then the contacts, we didn't have necessarily the contacts, right? Mm-hmm. But with them, when they leave, then you can, right? Then of course you can go on. And they are the ones that have contacts with others, right? Mm-hmm. They're the conduit to different circles. But no, we did not have any direct. Absolutely no direct, only what we read. Yeah, only what we read about.
Excellent. Now I'm going to shift our interview now to just get some of your reflections, both about your sister and her wider impact. So could we begin by just describing some of your fondest memories of Halyna? And these can be personal memories or memories from projects you worked on together.
She was always very fierce. She was very loyal. She was very, and she was very, very kind, very kind. And she was very focused. So often in her house, she would bring in people going through a lot of struggle. They would come and they would live with her. So Halyna was very supportive of people, but not she wasn't in their face. She was just, she offered a home, a rest, and a place for them to get better. And that was her home. So she was extremely kind, but she was always an activist. She was always an activist, and she was extremely hardworking, right? So she'd get up early in the morning, and then when she would come home, there was always meetings that she was going off to, and then coming back and then reading and, and doing the work that is necessary to keep things going. And she was very dynamic. She ran for the New Democrats, New Democrats in Strathcona. She didn't win, but she had the largest number of people in her campaign at that time. And the person who matched that and exceeded that was her daughter, Chrystia Freeland, in this last campaign. She had more people. But previously, it was Halyna who had the most volunteers working on her campaign. So, so some of my fondest memories are, of course, growing up with Halyna. We were gruesome twosome. We used to pretend that we were twins growing up, but of course we weren't twins. that we had to let that one slide, and talking at night about how we were going to change the world and how we're going to make it better. So that's really fun. And then just seeing her initiatives and her drive to make them succeed. And then the last sort of the other really fond memory I have of her is when she first moved to Ukraine. And there was a legal reform project, Ukrainian Legal Foundation, that had some, but it was very weak. And she was able to provide it real leadership and to make it a real going concern. So, to build an independent judiciary and law. They didn't even have a law library when Ukraine, there was no training for judge. There was no independent legal system. Now we can say, do we have a legal system there now? It's much better than it was. It's a process, and it's gone up and down. When she was involved with it, it was she really brought in a lot of changes. She was able to get a lot of funding. That's one of her talents, is that she was, the projects, okay, this project, let's do the budget. What do we need? And then she was able to sell it to get a grant money to make the project happen. It's a very good talent that she had. So it was something that she was able to do in Ukraine. So and how happy she was at first, and then how sad she was when she saw that it was being abused by the people that she had worked with so closely with, right? So that was a great disappointment for her. Because she gave it her all. She moved over there. She worked really hard. She made a number of important contributions. She sat on that committee that developed the Ukrainian Constitution as a representative of the legal foundation. So she was able to bring in, different things. So while I wasn't there with her at that, but hearing about it and her talking about it and knowing the struggle she was going through, right? And then to see it being derailed was very, very sad. So I think my fondest memories of her also in Common Woman books with that T-shirt. If I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. She loved to dance. She just loved to dance. She loved to have a good time. It was always when we would get, her method of organizing is, have a potluck supper or a potluck gathering, and then let's talk politics. And then let's move on the action, right? So you're always socializing and politics, and that was her approach, and it was very good. She was a great cook. And and she would try different types of cuisine, and it's like she would go through different periods. Her Indian cooking was phenomenal, and she would make everything, the naan bread, like everything. Nothing was purchased, right? Of course the key ingredients, right? The ingredients, but nothing was purchased. She made it all. Yeah, she was a great cook. She loved to have a good time. And she loved to make change.
It's a great combination of qualities in a person. You've touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering if you could discuss the impact of Halyna's initiatives on both the Ukrainian community in Edmonton or Canada, but also on Ukraine. I know you've just spoken a little bit about Ukraine and the work she did there after independence.
Yeah, so I think she had a big impact in Ukraine for the time that she was there. And then at the end, wasn't as successful, but she started a number of things in Ukraine. She took part, as I said, in the Constitution, in developing the Ukrainian Constitution, very important. She lobbied for and was able to get a number of law faculties established at different universities. So that's one of the things that the foundation was successful at. She started the library so that you had a library of legal decisions, right? And that was taken over. I'm not 100% sure, but I do believe that it still exists. So that's a very important contribution that she made. So that's in Ukraine. Her impact in Canada, I've talked about extensively. So she was she was recognized by many people and by the community. So when she died and we had a funeral here, the church was just full. and it included, many people. So she not only touched people that worked with her, but I think people loved her. Not I think, I know that people loved her. They loved, they were so, the impact that she had made on their life, and that, so that was that. So politically, yes, but politics for her was not dry. It wasn't separate, right? It was the love of life, right? And one of the things about Halyna is that she was so quick to cry. Always, always. So the minute there was a sadness, right? So we would watch Bambi. She was just in tears from the very beginning, right? Like that, but that's just an example. Like something was said, and you look at her, and she's just like full of tears, right? So she, anyhow, she had a lot. She wore her emotions up front, and she, and her heart would break often with inequities. Because of inequities, her heart would be breaking now.
Yeah, it's a hard time in many senses right now, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some challenges that she encountered, but perhaps more importantly, how would she mitigate challenges that she encountered?
She would talk it through, or she would organize. When there was a challenge, she would organize. Okay, so, matrimonial properties, she go to other lawyers, they formed a committee, they lobbied, they, put forward arguments until they were heard. That's an example, right? So that's how she approached problems. Said, there's a problem. Like, who are the stakeholders? Who are my fellows that I can work with? Who is it? Let's get together. Let's move on this, right? So that was her approach, how she challenged. I think that in Ukraine, the challenge, working with some people, what happened is that in the legal foundation, when she worked there and she restructured it and etc., she and I had a conversation. I mean, she called me. She was talking about things and good. So when she was structuring, she said, well, what should I do? Should I be president or should I be not? And I said, Halyna, don't give up your power. Because for her, she says, well, I'm not Ukrainian. Those are I'm not from there. So it should be somebody else. And I said, don't give up your power. And I said that only because in my experience, I had given up my power. And so when you give up your power, you give up your power. Then you're toast. And not at first, right? At first, there's this period, oh, yes. And then you're not there. You're there, and then you're not there, right? And so the person that was president, when it became advantageous for him to take over that to have it support his political ambitions, the organization fell apart. And and then afterwards she said, I should have listened to you. But it's not a question of me being right. It's a question of the disappointment that she had with the people, with the person there who acted as if she didn't exist. And she then moved to live with her daughter Chrystia. She had some health issues already. She had Parkinson's, early onset Parkinson's. And she moved, and she was going to take on a contract. They lived then in London, England. She was going to take on a contract. And she wrote to him and she says, could you write a letter of recommendation and talk about the work that I did at the foundation? He says, no, I can't. your contribution was not significant. Right. And that was really a painful moment. So not, working with people, trusting them, being, together, and then having them turn on you to that extent was really a real disappointment for her. It didn't, so how did she deal with that challenge? It was just something she had to accept at that point, right? But the good part is her art, seeing an issue, getting the right people together, and moving forward and having a good time while doing it. So yes.
And to conclude our interview today, I was wondering if there are any other stories that you wanted to share with me today.
No, I think we've talked about a lot about the stories. I think that I was just it was great fun to be with Halyna. And it was also very meaningful, right, at the same time. So that's who she was, and yeah, she impacted the community in a very big sense. When Common Woman Books closed down, there was a really good article in the Edmonton Journal, which at that time was a good newspaper, about the impact that Common Woman Books had, and how sad it is that it the passing of a time is, I'm not exactly sure what they talked about, but just to give you an example of, books, bookstores come and go, right? Not everybody gets articles in the Edmonton Journal when they go on, right? So it just I would say that she had a huge impact to the politics. Probably maybe not enough in terms of the actual organized Ukrainian community, but she was true to her beliefs.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chrystia.
Very welcome.